Welcome to Stoa. My name's Caleb. This is our first video we've done for the Stoa Conversations series.
Yeah, woohoo. My name is Michael. Hi, everybody.
So today we're going to talk about Stoicism and emotions. Do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So excited to talk about this topic. I think it's a really important topic, an interesting one. And I think a lot of people get into Stoicism because they're interested in kind of regulating their emotional life. Or more importantly, there's something kind of wrong with their emotional life. Like you think people get into fitness because they want to be fitter. They want to kind of either look a different way or be able to do something differently. And people typically are attracted to Stoicism because uh, they want to respond to situations differently, whether that's uh, excessive anger, excessive kind of fear or anxiety, or poor emotional regulation, or things like this. People tend to say, like, the emotional part of my life is one that I want to improve. It's one that I want to work on, and they see kind of Stoicism as a way to do that. I mean, it was that way for myself too. One of the things that attracted to me is I saw, a good emotional life as being a really important part of a good life, and I saw Stoicism as kind of a way to help with that. Um, but Stoicism and emotions is really complicated. Maybe not really. There's certainly more complicated parts of the philosophy, but it's not as simple as just
Mhm.
don't worry about it, or don't care about the things outside of your control. That's a part of it, but that's kind of a kind of surface level part of it. And the theory is I think more robust. And when you understand it in a more robust way, it's more helpful. It's more um, it can respond to more situations. So I really wanted to dig into this and jump into it.
Yeah, let's go for it. What do you got?
Yeah, sweet. So um first thing I want to start with is just the cognitive view of emotions. So when we're thinking about stoicism, when you say where do we start with stoicism and emotions, where do we start with kind of, again, anger, fear, love, grief, these core things? I think the cognitive view of emotions is the first thing you need to understand when you're thinking about stoicism and emotions. And the cognitive view of emotions in
Mhm.
its simplest form is the view that cognition, or kind of the thoughts, the judgments that we make, are really causally linked with emotions, or if not the emotions themselves. And so the Stoic view is that emotions, and the feelings that we associate with them are just value judgments. So an example of this, I was thinking of this example. Um, the World Cup's on right now, so you have something like a soccer game. You have one specific situation, right? So you have the outcome of the soccer game. I'm Canadian. Canada just lost to Belgium 1-0. So this is a single event. Um, and if you're a Canadian and you really care about soccer and you've observed this event, you go, Canada lost, you get really upset, you get really maybe angry, maybe just sad about it. If you're from Belgium and you observe the event, you get really happy. And if you're someone who doesn't really care about soccer at all, you feel nothing, right? And so the Stoicism makes this really interesting insight, even 2,000 years ago, that look, the same event can produce a different response in three different people, a positive emotion, a negative emotion, and indifference. And the difference there is not the event. The difference there is the way that we
Mhm.
perceive the event, the way that it matches with our values, or whether or not it corresponds to what we want to have happened. So whether or not we think it's a good thing or we think it's a bad thing, or we don't care about it at all. Um, and so that's the cognitive view of emotion, is that when you're making a kind of a value judgment about the situation, you're saying Canada losing is a bad thing or Belgium winning is a good thing. It's that value judgment that is the emotion. It's that value judgment that corresponds with the feelings we associate with happiness or grief. Um, and that, if you haven't thought much about emotions, is a really interesting insight and really kind of a change in perspective. Um, because I know for someone like me, I had this view for a long time that emotions were um, kind of things that happen to you, things that you experience, things that you you handle emotions well. I looked at this view of, like, anger is just something that happens, and you handle anger
Mhm.
well by adjusting to it, by riding the wave correctly, so to speak. but it wasn't something that you had a part in kind of producing. And so the cognitive view of
Right.
emotion flips that and say, look, your judgment is what's producing that. Um, yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell. What are your thoughts, Gil?
Well, this of course um, brings up the common Stoic line that it's not things in themselves that harm us, but our opinion of them. And I think a common view of emotions is that they are almost like sort of physical sensations, in the sense that they arise whether or not we think about them in a specific way. Um, but how we think about the world shapes how we experience it. And this is one of the most solid and useful Stoic ideas, certainly.
Yeah, and as I said, like kind of that sensation, like something like hunger or something like tiredness. It's kind of a thing that is connected to this animal part of you, right? It's this thing that um I don't know, this kind of lower part of you, and maybe this you because there's this stereotype of kind of, you have the cold rational person, right? And that rational person is not emotional. And then you have the kind of emotional, you think of like a child, and the child is they're not they're not intelligent, they're not cognitively developed, but they're being pulled around by their feelings. Um, but the Stoic view is to say, look, like this is kind of a false dichotomy, or this is the false way of dividing it. And the child is in a
Hmm.
sense, children are not as they're still growing up, right? So they're still developing mentally, but you know, the kid is still getting upset over the things that they value, right? They're still getting upset. They're like, they want free time, or they want to do what they want to do, or they want a treat and they can't have it. Or you're making them go to bed when they don't want to go to bed. And it's still these kind of judgments that are producing these responses. They're not just, again, as you were pointing out, they're not just things that occur. Um, and it's a really kind of a paradigm shift when I started thinking about it, and it had a huge impact on my thinking. Um, but I think sometimes when I read about Stoicism, or I go on kind of Reddit or the internet, I can still see people kind of looking at Stoicism as this thing of like, accept what's not up to you, and your emotions are not up to you, so you just need to kind of ride them out, or you can not judge the situation. And I think that it's like, you don't want to add a negative emotion onto a negative emotion. So if you're being angry or you're getting upset, and the thing I always say, you don't want to be upset about being upset. You don't want to like really judge yourself in the moment, but you do
Hmm.
want to take responsibility, and you do want to take accountability for those feelings. Yeah. And so yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting and really important part of it. And as you said, it connects back to Epictetus really well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you always want to break negative cycles whenever you can. And part of that is thinking better. That's the sort of the central upshot of the cognitive model of emotion, both in Stoicism, but also different forms of therapy.
The other part that I was thinking about that I want to talk about, so you have this kind of first distinction, um, which is this idea that, what you think determines how you feel, right? And if you think better, you can feel better. And that's the cognitive view of emotions. And that's really powerful. Um, but another thing that I've been writing about or thinking about that I think Stoicism teaches that's really important in this sphere is like, that's just kind of a descriptive view, right? That's not telling you what to do with your emotions,
Hmm.
or how to feel about them. That's just saying the kinds of things they are. And then I think Stoicism goes a step further and says, given this fact, um, the way that you should treat your emotions, the way that you should relate to them, is as pieces of information about your thought processes and about the quality of your thought processes, not as tools to be harnessed. And this is, I think, that's something that I see, or something that I used to do. So I did a lot of sports. To do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu primarily. That's like my primary sport. And you have this view of like, well, I need to get in the right headspace, or I need to get angry, or I need to get motivated. And you're trying to like incite these feelings in yourself as like tools and as ways of motivating myself. Um, and the problem with that is that if you see emotion as a tool, you'll start, you know, telling yourself lies. You'll start convincing yourself things. You'll start entering these kind of unhelpful thought processes or these incorrect, false thought processes just to kind of produce the feeling you want. The opposite end of this would be something like kind of toxic positivity, which has come up, which is this, people that are not willing to let in any sort of bad fact about the world into their consciousness, or they're not willing to
Hmm.
think about it or relate to
Yeah.
it. Um, and that's a kind of this example of using these emotions as tools. So you're saying, look, I want to feel a certain way, and I'm going to think what I have to think to feel that way. And I think Stoicism says that, you've got that all wrong, right? What you want to do is you want to think the right way. And when you think the right way, you will also happen to feel good. But you can't kind of skip it. You can't kind of flip the order like that, right? You have to really get the foundation of relating to situations well, relating to things appropriately, maturely, thinking about things in the right way, not catastrophizing, not blowing things out of proportion, not ruminating, things like this. And if you're able to do that, then the proper feeling will come. And so instead you stop. When I started practicing Stoicism, instead I stopped looking at these emotions as things to be harnessed to get a result I wanted, and I started looking at them as pieces of information, right? So while I'm feeling acutely stressed about a situation, and I don't want to be stressed. I don't think perhaps the situation warrants me being stressed, you know? So then I started thinking, or started adopting this kind of Stoic way of thinking, and I started going, well, why am I stressed? What do I value that I think is in jeopardy? Is it actually in jeopardy? Do I actually value it? I started using these kinds of questions. And um that was really helpful, because sometimes what happens, is like you think the emotion then is totally reasonable, even though it feels bad. You're sad, but when you interrogate it, you go, this is a bad thing that happened. I kind of should be sad. And you stop trying to make the feeling go away and you just ride it out, right? And that's a second kind of paradigm shift that I think comes from adopting this cognitive view of emotions, and then kind of saying, well, what does that tell us? Well, that tells us we should be looking at the way we feel as information about how we think, as kind of a feedback process about how we think.
So, how do you think about the response that people often push, which is that, well, sometimes particular feelings are just useful, whether it's in a sports context or whether it's in the boardroom. It can be useful to adopt almost, even if not explicitly false beliefs that one isn't certain are true.
Yeah, I think so. Like, you can raise an example of somebody who's in like a terrible situation, like uh, they've been kidnapped or something, and they're just like, somebody's going to come save me. And it's this kind of, you don't really have evidence of that. And you think of the kind of,
Right.
the hyper rational person be like, well, what's your proof of this? But it's kind of like a life raft, right? It's like an incorrect belief. I mean, one I would think in like, and I'm interested in what you think, Caleb. I think in like life or death situations, or these kind of extreme like situations where you will emotionally break. I think sometimes you can kind of put on a piece of armor and be like, okay, you know, this is not necessarily true, but you can believe it for now, and that serves a function. But I think those kinds of situations are really, really uncommon, I guess. And I think those would be kind of really extreme situations. And 90% of the time, 95% of the time, you're doing yourself a disservice, because you're not confronting the world as it is, and you're not learning to kind of adapt or adjust around the world as it is with those facts in mind. Um, that's what I would say. I would say, look, I'm not going to blame somebody who's been in a worse situation than me for adopting kind of a belief that allows them to survive. But I don't think that applies in like, I don't think that's healthy in situations beyond that. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, so another context might be sometimes people talk about an entrepreneurship. It's useful to have a sort of unreasonable belief in oneself, nearly delusional sort of belief that one will succeed or something of this sort. And I think one thing that one can say about that sort of thing is first, many entrepreneurs who have this sort of attitude initially might be paid off in the short term, but not in the long term. And that's one quick note to make. The more substantive issue, though, is I think one always needs to be careful and see like what are the actual beliefs that are held by the person. And in some cases, you might find that the person has a very strong sense of self-confidence, but their belief that their project will work is actually not so high. So I think there are, say, stories of maybe take someone like Jeff Bezos, who was asked by some initial investor about how likely he thought it would be that Amazon was successful. And he said, maybe like 33% or something like that, which, I mean, he's still someone who gives off a sense of confidence, but if you're able to hold perhaps an accurate belief about how likely you are to succeed, that actually tears apart from beliefs about your own ability or beliefs about how good you are at the task at hand.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing from that is like, can you achieve the results, which is this like drive, this grit, this stick-to-itiveness, this effort? Can you achieve that result with as few false beliefs as possible, or as least destructive false beliefs as possible? And like, yeah, so what comes to mind when you say that is something like a growth mindset, right? So maybe you have confidence or belief in yourself to succeed over time, and that allows you to like really commit to things, but it doesn't involve kind of a blindness to like the market conditions of Amazon or the potential of its success, right? And I think that would be a better way of approaching it. I agree.
So there's always another kind of fun philosophical argument here, which is that sometimes it's rational to be irrational. So in particular situations, say odd game theoretic type situation where you need to strap into a car, and the other person is also going to strap into a car, and for some strange reason you need to win some contest of nerves of you two facing off against each other and the cars going towards one another. In that case, if you really need to win in this hypothetical experiment, it might be useful adopting some sort of false beliefs.
Yeah, I think this just connects. I think you're just getting back to ethics here, right? Is like the thing is like, what is the end goal, right? And if the end goal is to like win this contest, then yeah, then to achieve that end goal, you're going to have to adopt whatever beliefs that fulfill that goal. But the Stoic, I guess you just like, everything's interconnected. You can't get away from that core Stoic proposition, which is that the good life is the rational life. The good life is the one where you live with knowledge, you accept the world as it is. And in that case, I don't think there's really going to be a situation that on the hardline Stoic view, there's not going to be a situation that supersedes that. In kind of a softer Stoic position, I think maybe those extreme situations I was bringing up, but this kind of rational position, or this kind of like a game theory position you're talking about of like, or you're playing chicken, the two cars are driving at each other. What was the example?
Yeah, exactly. That's it. That's the case.
Yeah.
You're
I mean,
chicken.
in that, it's like, yeah, it would be rational if the end goal is to win that game. Then your irrationality becomes like a way to win the game. But that's I guess a bit too abstracted out from life, right? Or
well, I think that it's an example of, just to give a more concrete example of that sort of thing, is that it's an example of a principle that to be taken seriously in one's commitments. Sometimes one should show that one will stick to those commitments, even if maybe in that particular world, one is going to be made worse off. So the sort of thing one might do is just always refuse to negotiate with terrorists, even if there's some sense in which it might be rational to negotiate with them under circumstances, just because in order to have that sort of character. Having the character that you don't negotiate with them means that over the longer run, that you'll be less likely to fall for their schemes. But I think the point that you make about the ethical, always going back to the ethical questions of these sorts of things, is useful, and to maybe become a little bit less abstract. The question is, what sort of game are you playing? And in that
Yeah.
case, it's typically important to have the beliefs that are good rather than are instrumental to some other purpose.
Yeah, I think that's right. If your game is to make as much money as possible, then, there might be some sort of concept. We might have to actually look, what entrepreneurs or make more money. Is it the really irrational ones, or is it the Jeff Bezos who are able to maintain, a grip on their likelihood of success or not? But that's kind of a different question from the Stoic question. And I guess the first part is that even if you just want to make as much money as possible, or even if you just want to be successful, sometimes just taking that Jeff Bezos approach that you mentioned, that approach on like finding a way to stay motivated while not diluting yourself, I think that should get more credit than it does, because I think people tend to go far down that other side of the spectrum in entrepreneurship, but also in kind of art or anything that's really difficult. People tend to lean into that kind of distortion. But then, so that's
Mm-hmm.
one view. But then the other picture is that like, well, the game isn't to be as successful as possible, or the game isn't to win as much money as possible. The game is to live well. And under that view, there's much, much, much less pictures where lying to yourself or accepting, like thinking things that are false to feel a certain way. There's many less cases where that's good.
Maybe some one other frame one can put on the sort of issue of emotions as information versus emotions as tools is that, in a way, treating emotions or feelings as information is more direct to your current aims, and you're not thinking about something like, how can I reduce all these feelings that feel bad? Instead, you're thinking about, what do these feelings say about what I'm trying to do in this current situation, whether it's with some project or with your relationships. And it's those things that are sort of out there that really matter, not so much your machinations with your interior feelings.
Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way. That's a great point. So the idea being that, like, what does it matter how you're feeling? You're kind of getting focused on yourself. You're kind of, what matters is how you're relating to the world around you. So don't get kind of caught up in regulating the feelings, moderating the feelings. Focus on, how am I relating to the actual, as you said, the relationships, my goals. And if that's good, the kind of the feelings will put themselves in line too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I find that kind of
Excellent.
pumps me
Well
up. So
interrupted.
one thing, and another part that I was talking about, which is one of my, I mean, we've already kind of hit on it a bit, but another upside to this cognitive view of emotions is that now there becomes kind of a responsibility that you have for your emotional life. I always remember it would be very funny when you'd hear like, or you'd see some bully or something, and you'd be like in elementary school, middle school, high school, and you'd be like, that guy's. People would be like, well, that person's just like an angry person. Like there would be kind of this like, I guess this kind of loss of responsibility. They'd be like, that person just is the way they are, and it's your job to kind of move around them or navigate around them. And that's not bad from kind of your perspective, but from their perspective, it's fundamentally untrue, right? Because, I mean, in a sense, they are an angry person or a vengeful person or a mean person. But all of these aspects of themselves are not things they can't control. They're all parts that they're participating in by their judgments, by the way they value the world, by the way they think about the world. And so that's the bully, but then that also applies to yourself. So if you have kind of it's your responsibility to have a good emotional life, because the way you think about the world, the judgments you form are up to you. You're the one that can change them, not somebody else can change them. And that really puts the onus on you. And I remember the Stoic metaphor, I think this is Chrysippus. Um, he talks about kind of the cylinder versus the cube, right? And the idea is that
Mhm.
if somebody comes along and they push the cylinder and it rolls, and they push the cube and it doesn't. And the cylinder rolling, that can be a metaphor for, a reaction to the stimulus, the push, right? The cylinder is that person that gets angry. The cube is the person that stays calm. And you say kind of, what was the cause of the anger? What was the cause of the movement? Was it the push? And Chrysippus' response is, it can't be the push because one thing rolled and one thing didn't. It has to be the shape of the object. The shape is the cause, right? So if you're quick to anger, you have kind of these emotional turmoil. I'm not to say you can snap out of it and change it immediately. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of practice. But at the end of the day, it's not the push. It's not the stimulus. It's the shape. And you have a responsibility and an ability to change your shape so that it's able to kind of succeed in the environment you're in and, ultimately be the shape you want it to be. And I find that really empowering. I know some people can I think it's important to recognize that like this is hard and this is a long process. I think people can feel like it's kind of a judgy part of Stoicism if they say
Mhm.
you should just be able to control that right away. And I that's not what Stoicism says. But what it does say is that, this is something that you can work on and you can change over time and you can improve. And I find that really empowering.
Mhm. Yeah, the point about how people think about stoicism being judgy is worth returning to, but sort of more directly on this line. There's the psychologist Albert Ellis, who was heavily influenced by the Stoics and created rational emotive behavioral therapy. Talks about how often patients would come in and they describe some less than ideal behavior, um, whether it's say maybe drinking too much or reacting in some way that hurt their loved ones. And quite often, Alice might just sort of ask some probing questions about that experience, and the patient would respond with some line eventually. It's just how I feel. That's why I reacted in that certain way. It's just because of how I felt. And what he would ask as a follow up is, but isn't it also how you think? Where I found that framing is always very useful because often, of course, we do find ourselves in situations where we initially react because of some feeling. And if one can pause and note, oh, I actually have some beliefs here. If it's in the case of anger about people doing some perceived wrong that needs to be righted. And is this belief actually correct? And addressing those beliefs is very, very useful for thinking about things like anger, especially.
Yeah, totally. I like that. Like, also how you think. Um, and I think coming back to the judgy part or coming back to why I think that person with Ellis might say, well, it's just how I feel, is that often we can feel, or often people feel shame for how they feel, right? So it's like, if you're just in this state, if you think your emotions aren't something you can control and change, then you feel this kind of shame for who you are. And so I think the first step people take is like, well, I shouldn't feel shame for that. That's who I am. I'm going to kind of love myself. And I think that's not a bad move, but you don't want to stop there, right? You want to kind of accept yourself as you are, but you don't want that to be the final step.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think there's also a separation between the ideas that are useful to apply to oneself and also the ideas or ways one might interact with others. So I think, the line, take responsibility for your own emotions, is useful to apply to yourself as you're planning and going about your own life. But it is true that that very same line can be misused when it's applied to other people, especially in conversation. If you just insist that the other person take responsibility for the fact that they feel bad and overlook the things that you are doing that is causing them to react in that way.
And I feel like
So there's always an additional complication here.
yeah, and I feel like that's such a superficial way of like, there's these layers to Stoicism, and I think that's like a superficial way that ends up, you see that person, they open Stoicism, they start reading Stoicism for the first time, and they're like, oh, other people's emotions are their problems. This is great news. I don't have to worry about me causing anything because, as Epictetus says, it's nothing I'm doing that's wrong. It's their judgment of me that's wrong. And I'm being a bit like I'm being silly there, but you can stop there, and that's not a great spot to stop in. But you see people using Stoicism or kind of Stoic-like thinking, or kind of distorting the dichotomy of control to be like, everything you're feeling is your problem. That's your baggage. It's not something I have to deal with. And yeah, not only is it judgy, I think that's like, pretty unhealthy way to relate to other people as well.
And the reverse mistake is also made, I think, where what might be more polite or more caring ways of interacting with others isn't always the same way one should relate to oneself. So I think, as you mentioned a little bit earlier, often some people might make the move to self-acceptance when really they shouldn't be accepting whatever is currently bother them, and it's better to change it.
Yeah, totally. I think a good point here, if it's okay with you, I want to segue into kind of some Greek terms, which is always my favorite, and to get a little bit technical in the Stoic language, because I think it will be really helpful and really clarifying. So one thing that I wanted to talk about, so I think this is kind of like a big picture paradigm that we've talked about, which is that, your thinking determines how you feel. So A, how you feel gives you information about your thought processes, and B, you should use that information to evaluate, am I thinking the right way? Am I relating to the world in the right way? Am I valuing the right things? Am I having kind of, am I thinking about things in ways I'd rather not? I'd rather change my perspective. So that's all. And that's kind of a really kind of big picture perspective on the paradigm that Stoicism takes towards emotion. And I think that's all really helpful. But one thing that's really helpful too is kind of clarifying, getting a little bit technical into the Greek, because it can give you, it can really help push the thinking deeper. And so when we use the word emotion, when we use the word emotion, the Greeks didn't have, the Stoics didn't have a word that was encapsulated emotions in the way that we use it. What they were using instead were kind of these subtypes. So they had a distinction between pathe, which sometimes gets called passions, and eupathe. And so pathe is passions, and then that's the Greek word for good. So one is kind of these emotions or these passions, and then eupathe is the kind of the good version of them, the good feelings. And I think that distinction is really important because we often, the Stoics' goal, the Stoic ideal of kind of emotional therapy was to eliminate pathe, was to eliminate passion. But the Stoics were entirely fine with eupathe, or good feelings. So I think it often gets misrepresented that the Stoic goal was to eliminate all of your feelings. That's not the case. The case is not to become indifferent to everything. The goal was to eliminate these, what I sometimes call unhealthy, negative emotions. And what determines if something is a pathe, something is a passion versus a good feeling, is the pathes were those that were built on false judgments. They were those that the result of mistaken judgments. So, Epictetus, I always go back to Epictetus. I think of an example, like if someone insults you in public and you think, your life is ruined, or you think your honor is in question, so you have to slap them across the face and you're super angry about it. These are passions, not just because they can be unpleasant feelings, but they're passions because they're based on mistaken judgments. There's false beliefs underlying them. And it's those that were really dangerous. It was those emotions that followed from irrational thinking, from incorrect thinking, not all feelings. The Stoics were totally open to other kinds of feelings. And I think sometimes that distinction gets lost.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on that?
I suppose what I would add to that is, in a sense, Stoicism isn't even about reducing negative emotions. I think often what people describe as negative emotions are grounded in true beliefs. Take something like remorse for mistakes that one has made in the past, or an appropriate level of sadness. I think there's also this point that, you know, the framing should always be a little bit more direct. Initially, it might be useful to use the tools of Stoic philosophy to address whatever crisis you might be in, and that may be a matter of many negative feelings and emotions. But the ultimate goal of Stoicism is serving as a life philosophy, and that involves acting well, making good decisions, and having correct judgments. Uh, I sound like I'm getting a little bit too preachy, but the general line that uh, I think it can be useful to think a reframe instead of thinking about Stoicism as reducing negative emotions to thinking about it as a complete system for acting well,
Totally. Because that's
believing in acting well, I should say.
that's Epicureanism, right? And like a lot of I think a lot of modern Stoics are Epicureans. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not trying to sit here and also be on a high horse and be like, oh, you're not even real Stoics, you're Epicureans, like it's some kind of bad thing. I think anybody that's like living intentional, I think is totally on the right path. And like I think that's great. But Epicureanism is about reducing suffering. And they said, look, if you're a good person, if you think about things the right way, you're going to suffer a lot less because, as you said, you're going to have a lot less remorse. You're going to feel a lot less angry. You're going to, have a lot less fear and anxiety. You're going to have these, you're going to reduce bad feelings that are unpleasurable feelings by being kind of a good person. And I think a lot of people get into Stoicism for that reason. They say, look, I want to reduce unpleasurable feelings. But as you point out, Seneca talks about this a lot, right? There's nothing wrong with the appropriate amount of grief, right? There's nothing wrong with if you allow something like grief to, be a life shattering moment, because you didn't accept the possibility that people you care about or life is temporary or things like this. I'm talking about this very big picture. Obviously, these things are difficult to move through, but
Hmm.
you know that's where you run into a problem, right? When it starts to go beyond its appropriate length and its appropriate intensity. But as you said, like even a Stoic will feel when something bad happens an appropriate amount of bad feelings. Um, and yeah, I think that's quite. I'm not sure if you're under the same impression. I think that's quite peculiar to some people who are starting to get into Stoicism and starting to understand
Yeah, as Seneca said, you may weep, but you must not wail.
it.
That's a exceptionally useful line for remembering the position.
Yeah, and the eupathe, so the kind of good feelings, again, not necessarily good because they're immediately pleasurable, but good because they're based on true judgments. They're like they're the result of thinking well or relating to the world properly. Um, you know, the the advancing Stoic feels a range of these, right? So the common example is something like caution, right? That's a really easy one. Even the sage would feel caution because even the perfect Stoic is not going to foolhardily, they're not going to walk off a cliff and say, death is nothing to me. And they're not going to, put their hand in a meat grinder or do these kinds of things. I mean, that's kind of extreme situations. They probably wouldn't even try to insult people or
Mhm.
try to make a scene, right? They would display the appropriate amount of caution, the appropriate amount of concern about not doing harmful things. That's totally, and then that's totally fine. And then you kind of, if you take this into the passion version, so either exaggerated for the wrong reasons, this would be kind of fear or anxiety. So there's I think in one sense they're based on their the passions are based on false judgments, but in another thing there is also kind of a intensity difference, or at least false judgments lend themselves to being more intense because you're kind of opening up yourself to kind of unlimited intensity. If you're not confined to reality, if you can think whatever you want to think, there's way more opportunities to experience way more unpleasurable feelings about the world.
To paraphrase Seneca, you could say passions are that which overleap reason and carry it away. They have some distorting effect on how you see the world, whereas positive emotions or eupathe don't have the same sort of drive to distort one's thinking.
Yeah, in a way they can't distort your thinking because they're not distorting, they're not out, so they're not wrong with the world, right? They're corresponding with the world.
Yeah,
so you're not
exactly.
pulled in a wrong direction. One thing that I wanted to bring up was this kind of Epictetus part, because you talked about the distorting nature of passions. And so Epictetus was really big on preventing passions from the get-go. So part of his therapeutic program was like, look, passions, like if you get angry, it just, you can't even think properly until you calm down, right? It totally changes the way that you interpret new information, that you deal with new situations. So passions have this negative compounding effect. You think something incorrect, you feel a passion, and now you're more likely to make incorrect passion-inducing kind of judgments as you go along, right? And so one of Epictetus's therapeutic things, which I always thought was really smart, was to just kind of abstain, just kind of take a step back and go, oh, okay, all of these kind of strong judgments that I have about, I need to be successful, or I need people to like me, or I need to, have a certain amount of, I don't know, achievement by a certain age, or I can't have these things happen to me because they'll ruin my life. We got to kind of just abstain from all those things, take a step back, because you can't even start practicing Stoicism properly if you're being constantly tossed around by these feelings. So I always thought that was a funny part to his kind of start of philosophy, was just like, just work on kind of abstaining from these extreme judgments altogether, because you can't even handle them yet.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's sort of like wait before trying the harder stuff or something like that is the general thought.
Yeah, totally.
Often wise.
What are your thoughts on
Did you say much about prepathe?
Oh no, I'll jump into prepathe. So this is the third of the pathe, which is great.
The third one.
The third one. I think it's like a pre-passion. So what this is this third category, and this is this idea that, like, we didn't talk much about Stoic psychology. Basic Stoic psychology is that, you experience an impression, you deliberate upon that impression. So something happens, you see a snake, you think, you deliberate on that vision of a snake. You say that that's a fake snake my friend put out to scare me, so I'm not afraid. Or I'm watching a TV show about snakes, so nothing can hurt me. Or you go, wow, that's actually a real snake in front of me. I'm in real danger. And depending on how you deliberate on this impression, you then get a response. Indifference or, fear if it's a real snake. That's kind of the picture. But the Stoic view was that there are certain sensations that you'll experience just from confronting certain kinds of impressions. And this was related to kind of our animal nature. So animals, they don't have this deliberation. It's kind of input, output. They receive an impression, they experience something. You put food in front of the dog is hungry, wants the food. And we're still like that with certain things. And the famous example was, it was Seneca, who said even the sage, even the perfect Stoic would flinch at thunder, right? And at lightning. There's nothing you can do about it. It's just an animal response that you're going to have to certain kinds of intense impressions. But they were saying that the important part there is to not run with it, to not add a judgment to it. So, you're going to flinch at lightning, but if you go, oh, silly me, it's just lightning, I'm in my house, there's no issue here, then that's going to immediately go away. And so the idea was that, like, look, it's okay if certain things disturb you or surprise you immediately, certain impressions are just going to be this strong. They're just going to have that immediate impression. What you don't want to do is add to it. You don't want to feed into it with unhealthy or incorrect thinking. And that's just the third type that's just interesting because, again, it's just like, look, there's this degree of forgiveness. You're not this stone. You're not this statue. There's going to be certain kind of fluctuations when extreme things happen. What matters is, okay, how do you respond to those impressions? Do you let them become full passions, or do you respond to them appropriately? That's just like a kind of an interesting third category. I don't know if I experienced too much of that in my own life. These pre-passions. I don't know if thunder. I mean, I guess you think of a horror movie, right? It's full of that, like jump scares. I don't know how much that takes
Right.
in our life, but it's a good third category to think about.
I suppose it's useful to think about impressions generally, or
Mhm.
um, often make the division between feelings and emotions, where feelings are closer to the initial impression, and it's emotion that includes the full judgment about the situation. So, you might feel if someone says something and you think you're insulted, you might have some initial feeling of rage. Then you might realize, oh wait, they're not. They're actually insulting someone else, and that's okay. So your judgment shifts that initial feeling. Um, I think that's a distinction I found quite useful for thinking about this sort of thing.
And I guess the therapy, and maybe you can say why you found it useful, but I guess the therapeutic insight would be something like, you don't have to lean into it. You don't, just because you felt that way doesn't mean that has to be kind of your emotion. It doesn't have to continue. Or what did you find in your own life? What did you find useful about it?
So I think it's useful because the focus is less on feelings, which are out of one's control to a large degree, and more on the judgments one is making. So um, I think it's just sort of a tool, or maybe not a tool, but a reminder to return to how you think and not be so concerned about whether you would initially feel a particular way when you do some action. So whether it's nervousness about some initial call that you think you need to make, maybe just sort of train myself to not just lean into that initial feeling. Instead, that's the feeling. Is it giving me any useful information? Maybe I need to prepare more or something like that. But that it's not a reason to avoid the call if it's something that I already came to the judgment about it being a good idea.
Yeah, I think anxiety is a really good example of that because I think anxiety is like, or fear or the kind of nervousness, because I think that's something that I've really been able to work on training myself to be like, I'll still feel it before I do almost anything, right? I'll still have that kind of pre sensation, anything that's like public speaking oriented or in front of people. But I've kind of gotten to this point where I think I'm able to do some stoic therapy myself and be like, well, I'm not going to be harmed in any way. Nothing bad is going to happen. Even the worst case scenario is not going to be something I'll really remember like a year or two from now. And that really helps me kind of get out of that spiraling. That's something I use all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a useful example, good example.
Yeah.
Well,
So, I mean, so we take all this information. We say, okay, so what do we do with it? So how do we kind of have a good emotional life? Um, and then I think there's kind of two aspects of it. One is we already talked about it is kind of um, there's kind of a preventative aspect. There's kind of a avoiding extreme emotions, and then there's kind of an aspirational aspect. And this I take a lot from Epictetus because Epictetus is the Stoic that I studied the most deeply. But Epictetus' thing is to say first you need to do when you're trying to regulate your emotions, you need to be honest with yourself. And I think this is a big problem a lot of people make is they say, well, oh, dichotomy of control, it's up to me. So now I can go and I can do this thing that's really hard for me, or that um is too emotionally difficult for me. It's like, no, it's not the case. You have to meet yourself where you are at that point. So one thing Epictetus really talks about is because emotions have this distorting effect, because passions have this distorting effect where they lead to more passions, they lead to kind of a negative spiraling. The first thing to do is actually what you can control is your environment, right? Take accountability for your environment to the extent that you can, and try to remove triggers, remove things that kind of incite these feelings, and kind of get out of this negative spiraling. And then when you're out of that negative spiraling, you can start to kind of reintroduce these things carefully and slowly, you know? So I'm trying to think of an example like this, but I think of something like, social anxiety or something as an example. You want to be able to talk to people comfortably. Well, the example is not going to be some major, public speaking event or some major, social activity. You want to kind of, remove yourself from these environments that throw you off, and you want to slowly, reintroduce, try sparking up a conversation with a stranger that you meet, start talking to somebody that you share an interest with or something like this. And you start to kind of gain this confidence talking to people, and you do that really slowly. It's this kind of slow exposure method. And I find that really helpful. Um, Another aspect is it's just kind of nerdier, but it has been helpful for me, which is a real clarification of value, a real kind of, so that's the kind of preventative thing. We don't want things to happen. So we don't want to feel extreme passion. So we avoid the situations that cause them. And then the other part is this kind of aspirational. We want to think correctly. And so taking our emotions as information, we start to think, well, what do I value that's causing this emotional life that I don't necessarily want? And are those values I want to hold to? And if they are, kind of accept the feelings that come with them. And if they're not, work on changing them, work on reconceptualizing them. And another is working on minimizing, what CBT calls cognitive distortions. So working on kind of identifying and minimizing situations where you just think incorrectly. So something like catastrophizing, if this happens, it's going to ruin my life, or things are never going to be the same, or a kind of a distortion of the importance or the significance of things. Another aspect, I guess this kind of third tip or third tool is one of focus. And that's a really important one that comes down to the dichotomy of control. The dichotomy of control is this view that some things are up to you, some things aren't, but it's this other picture that you should focus on the things that are up to you. So there's this, when we're doing emotional work, part of that is like, don't think that thing is scary, or don't think that bad thing can happen. But another part is just like, shift your attention elsewhere, right? Try to get into the zone, try to shift your attention onto you, what you're doing in the moment, how you're functioning in the moment. I think athletically, and all these examples to me are sport, but I think athletically that really helped me, because, once I started thinking just about my performance and I stopped thinking about what other people thought of it, what it meant about how good I was and things like that, I started losing a lot of kind of the anxiety or the fear or the anger or the upsetness that came with it. So yeah, that's kind of the three ones that I think I use the most or think about the most. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, those are all excellent. Just to add some items to that list, I suppose. Um, I think mindfulness meditation is useful as a way to sort of internalize or illustrate the cognitive theory of emotion. So by paying careful attention to one's sensations and thoughts, one can sort of clarify how, in fact, how we feel and how we think are often quite separate, and some feeling of discomfort might be a constellation of different sensations or thoughts, instead of some like intrinsically bad thing. So that's one item I'd add to your list.
Yeah, I think that there's kind of
It's very exhaustive.
there's kind of an internal literacy. I don't know if there's a better metaphor for that. That mindfulness really helps pull up this kind of idea of like, okay, like, because I've been talking about like it's obvious, right? Like, well, your thoughts determine your feelings, so just think about your thoughts. But that's not really obvious. And sometimes, as you said, they can be a constellation of thoughts. It can be things that you haven't articulated. It can be things that you don't really have the language for yet. And so sitting down and kind of checking into those, spending some time getting familiar with the shape of your mind and your thinking, is really, really a helpful tool. Yeah, to kind of be able to navigate this space successfully. Totally.
Yeah, I think it's always useful to, pick one of these techniques and focus on it for a period of time. So, for me, I think that's diving back into doing some, simple meditation whenever I've lost a habit or something of that sort. Um, and then, down the line, I might add some focus on some additional technique or
Totally.
approach.
Yeah, whichever one works for you. Like, I think that as the point of a toolkit is that you pull the one out that's appropriate, right? And the one that's well suited to your disposition and in your current position. So what I've used has changed over time. And I think that's totally normal.
Absolutely. Well, there's so much more to talk about here, and we'll definitely open up some more boxes, address some of these questions that we may have dropped a little bit over the course of this series. So thanks so much for listening. Please reach out to us if you have any thoughts or feedback. And you got anything else to add to that, Mike?
No, great. I was just like, as I said, questions on other things you'd like to see us talk about, any sort of feedback, always appreciated. And yeah, great talking to you, Caleb. Super fun.